Hey everyone, welcome back again. My name is Carl Carpenter. I'm with Arrakis Consulting, and this is going to be one of our first in the weeds videos that we keep talking about. We spoke about what is risk on February the 11th, 2023. So this is a more in the weeds video in relation to what is risk and how it can affect you. Lots of things to think about. So I do appreciate you joining. So be sure and get a cup of coffee or a beer or a glass of water, whatever floats your boat, and let's get into risk. So as we discussed in the previous video, risk is the potential for something, who knows what that something is, to happen that is not ideal or to the best benefit of your company or maybe your client or something like that. This something is generally related to some sort of loss or damage to the company. And it could be short-term loss, long-term loss, who knows. So does that mean that risk is not manageable? Absolutely not. There's always something that can be done for the something that represents the risk. But that also requires, being proactive and things like that and having funding to take care of the risk. So as it relates to risk, it's important to understand that there's inherent risk and also residual risk. So inherent risk is essentially the risk that is happening right here, right now, or otherwise known as short-term risk. Residual risk is the long-term risk of something. So you could have short-term risk, and if you identified that risk and then you did something about it to make that risk not seem so bad, that's awesome. But that doesn't mean you won't have long-term risk that you still have to consider. Generally, when you're evaluating risk, short-term risk is higher and riskier than long-term risk. And then I do have in the slides here inherent and versus residual risk, which I just went over, and quantifying risk. We'll talk about quantifying risk in a few minutes. Quantifying risk, though, just in a nutshell, is essentially what is the dollar value of that risk. So, and then moving along, as we understand what our risk is, both short and long term, we definitely want to assign a dollar value to it. We don't want to make decisions without considering the impact to the company. So in relation to looking at risk, we want to look at it logically, without emotion, and evaluate what the chances of the risk happening. What are the chances of the risk happening? And that in that case, we call that likelihood. So what is the likelihood of the risk happening? So for example, if you have an office in California, the likelihood of an earthquake affecting your company is much higher than the likelihood of an earthquake affecting a company in Arizona. And if you have an office in Houston, the likelihood of being affected by a hurricane is much more than the likelihood of a hurricane affecting Arizona. On the flip side, the likelihood of a dust storm or a giant heat wave affecting you in San Francisco is much less than Arizona. So what we want to do is evaluate how bad the risk can affect us as a part of that. So we take the likelihood, how often is it going to happen, and then we take the impact of the risk and we multiply those. So how we do it at Arrakis is we basically give a likelihood, a scale of 1 to 10. So we don't want to use terms that could be interpreted differently. So we do not use high, medium, and low, or red, yellow, green. We don't do things like that because the likelihood of somebody who views a risk as high may not be the same for every single person. So we want to use math every chance we get. So we use a scale of 1 to 10 for both. So what we want to do is evaluate the likelihood of whatever and give it a number from between 1 to 10. And then we evaluate the impact of the risk and give that a number. So in the example you see in the PowerPoint slide there, we have the likelihood is 10, which means it's going to happen a lot. And the impact is 10, which means it's really bad. So the value of that risk would be 100. And again, you want to do this mathematical process for pretty much everything. Now, does that mean you have to use 1 to 10? No, you can use 1 to 100 or 1 to 5. But you have to be consistent across all of your risk assessment programs to make sure there's, the same scale is used on everything. So in this case, again, let's say, let's take the COVID, for example. Who would have thought a pandemic would affect the world the way it did? So the impact of COVID in the beginning was definitely a 10 for everyone, all the companies that are out there. Everybody had immediately figured out how to go work remotely and so on. So that was a huge impact, and as time went on, the impact kind of went down because companies and human beings adjusted. Then there's the likelihood. It is surprising, but when COVID came out, we ran, what is the likelihood of a pandemic happening? What is the likelihood of a pandemic happening again? So we ran the numbers. And if I remember correctly, strangely enough, a pandemic literally hits the planet about every 8.5 to 9 years. And if you think about it, you got like H1N1, bird flu, all the other things that's come out that I don't remember right now. But the point is, pandemics actually do happen more than we think. It's just that they're not as popular as COVID was. So once we figure that out, we have a risk value, of 100, and we want to apply that same concept to all our risks, the same mathematical process to all of our risks. And what that does is it allows us to look at risk and see what is the most dangerous risk that we need to consider right away, and after we do some stuff, what is our long-term risk? All right, so once we've done this, we've looked at all the possible risks out there. I already mentioned COVID, but if you're on the West Coast, then you probably should be considering earthquakes, floods, tsunamis. If you're in specific wooded areas, you probably should consider forest fires, and so on. If you're in the desert, think about cooling. If you're on the coastline and on the Gulf Coast or the East Coast, think about hurricanes, tornadoes. If you're in Florida, you might want to think about practically everything. There's seems like Florida gets hit all the time with stuff. You also want to evaluate risks in relation to human beings. Like when you hire somebody, to do a specific job, what's the risk they're going to screw that job up? How do you know they even are trained to do the job that you hired them for? Did you do a background check? Did you do a certificate check or a reference check? If you didn't do those things when you hired someone, then you probably have an increased risk that the person lied to you on their resume, because nobody lies on resumes anymore, right? So, all right, so there's a bunch of things you should figure out in relation to that. So once we figured out what our risks are, we've evaluated our inherent risks, that is, and we've done the math. We figured out what's risky, what's not. We want to have some sort of plan to reduce the risk, make it not seem so bad. And that's called risk management, by the way. So there's quite a few things that you could do in relation to risk. All right, so you definitely want to have a game plan. And you might be surprised with some of the options that you have here. And we'll talk about those options, as well. But definitely want to have a game plan. So the first thing you can do is mitigate the risk. And another way of saying that is fix it. So, for example, let's say you have no antivirus in your company. That's a risk. It's a risk for ransomware. It's a risk for viruses in general. It's a risk that a person's going to click the link and then they're going to download something and then it's going to spread like wildfire across your network. That would be a risk. So to mitigate that risk, what you could do is buy antivirus software. Spread it, or put antivirus on every single device on your network and go from there. That would be a way to mitigate the risk. Now, what you can also do, and this is not necessarily a good idea, but you can accept it. Let's say you can't afford to fix it. You can't afford to mitigate the risk. You can just choose to accept it. So, for example, we had a situation with one of our clients that whatever needed to be fixed, and the federal government was going to say, we're going to fine you $25,000 a year unless you fix this problem. The problem is that the problem, in order to fix it, would have cost about $4 million. So doing the math, it was really simple to figure out. If it's costing you $25,000 a year, but $4 million to fix the problem, then the realistically, the choice was just to accept the risk and accept the fine, because by the time the fines added up to $4 million, the odds are that some sort of new technology would come out and we'd have to upgrade anyways. So it's something that's out there. Having said that, what you should absolutely understand, whenever you accept a risk, you accept all aspects of that risk. So if you accept a risk and something bad happens, that's one thing. Something bad happens to your customers because you chose to accept a risk, that's something else completely different. And in some cases, you could be facing some pretty serious sanctions that you don't want to, have to deal with. You can also transfer risk. And what I mean by transferring risk is, let's say you're supposed to perform a task, but you simply don't have the manpower or the experience to do the task, or even know how to do it in general. It's super simple. What you can do is outsource the task to another company. You can say, hey, I don't have the time to patch all of my devices the way I'm supposed to per whatever regulatory environment. So you could hire a company, a managed service provider or MSP, to do all of your patching for you. Arrakis coincidentally does that. So there's all sorts of things that you can transfer the risk to another company to take care of that. Obviously there is a cost to it, but generally that cost is far cheaper than doing it in-house, given that you have to hire somebody, the cost of overhead with a 401k, medical, dental, and all that other good stuff that employees get, things like that. So that certainly is possible to transfer it. Another way of transferring risk is by having cyber insurance. But there is a risk in that itself. So you can have a risk, and as a part of that risk, you could say, well, we have an issue where we need to have some more protection, so we're going to have cyber insurance. Certainly possible to do that, but it's also important to understand that a cyber insurance company is another business. Their job is to get you to pay for insurance, and then their job also is to not pay you if there's a payout. So one of the risks of using cyber insurance, if that's an intention, is that if you're not doing what you're supposed to do, and that is the reason why cyber insurance, why you filed a claim, they will deny you. They will deny you the payment because you were supposed to do what you're supposed to do. Sort of like car insurance. If you choose not to wear your seatbelt, but you get in a wreck and you get injured, the insurance company ain't going to pay that out. It's not their job to be responsible for you and remind you to wear a seatbelt every single time. It's just, unfortunately, that's just the way cyber insurance is. It's their business. They don't want to give you money if they don't have to. But it's a valuable tool to consider. You can also avoid risk. So avoiding risk is certainly something to consider because it's almost like mitigation. It's kind of in between mitigation and accepting, but it leans more towards mitigation. So, for example, one of our clients had some kind of device that measures the diameter of wires, and these wires are like much smaller than the width of a human hair. And I don't know why that's important or not, because I don't do that. I just cybersecurity and IT. Well, this client, apparently this machine that did this, was worth about $750,000, so $750,000 to do this, and it's a really cool machine. Problem is, it only ran on Windows 95. So in 2020, when we first brought this client on board and we found this out, Windows 95 is not an acceptable operating system anywhere nowadays, but they couldn't get rid of the machine itself because it was critical to their job. So what they did, in order to avoid the risk of Windows 95, what they did was essentially they removed it from the network and, well, obviously the internet as well as a part of that. It was not able to be plugged into anything. And then the Ethernet ports, we just filled those with hot glue, so it was impossible for somebody to accidentally plug it in. So that's certainly a way of avoiding risk. And in this particular case, they had no choice because it was a $750,000 computer that measured wires, and that it was critical to their company, and they couldn't afford another $750,000, probably more, computer that ran Windows 11 or Windows 10. So you can avoid risk, and taking things off the network, removing it from the network where it can't talk to anybody is certainly an option. Another way of avoiding risk is to simply turn things off. If you have 15 servers, but you really only need 3, it sounds like if you got rid of 12, you would not only mitigate, but you'd also avoid risk at the same time and probably make your life easier with all the overhead of managing servers just going away. So there's lots of things you could do in relation to risk, but generally it's mitigate, accept, transfer, and avoid. However, it's super important that when you identify a risk, that you document it. So you have to write down, you've identified a risk, make sure, and that's called a risk register, by the way. So you identify the risk, you document it, and what your plan is to fix it. And the plan is called Plan of Action and Milestones, or POAM. And this is for a few reasons. First off, you have to do it. It's a risk assessment, and documenting it is a regulatory requirement. No way around that. If you're regulated, you must be doing this, or else you're not compliant. And if you did have an issue and you did have cyber insurance, you want to make sure that you are not going to be in a position where the cyber insurance can deny your claim if you file for one. So that you really want to protect yourself in that way. And if there's ever and lastly, if there's ever an issue about risk that possibly could affect your end users, you really want to have things documented, because you absolutely don't want anything affecting like customers and so on that could possibly be, viewed as negligence. So simply identifying risk, having a risk register, writing down a plan of action, things like that, gives the impression of proactivity, and that's certainly valuable. What's more valuable, though, is actually doing what you say you're going to do if you identify a risk. What you absolutely do not want to do, not only from the business level or from the individual cybersecurity or IT person level, is not tell anybody. If you've identified a risk, then you absolutely should tell somebody else. I would, when I was a low-level LAN guy, IT guy, desktop guy, I always, if I found something that was risky, I always told my boss, because I did not ever want anybody to say, well, Carl knew about this, but he never told anybody, so we couldn't fix it. So somebody has to take the blame, and in that case, it would have been me. So the more awareness you bring to everybody about a risk, then the better off you are. That doesn't mean you go crazy with it, because some risks should be a little bit more secret than others. Like if you find a password or administrator account with a very weak password to it, you don't want to go broadcast that across the entire company, but you absolutely should be telling somebody and documenting it in such a way that the company is more protected. All right, so what should you do with risk? We've identified a risk, we've we've figured out the likelihood and impact, and I said we'd quantify it. So let's do that. So in this particular case, we're just going to come up with some fake sample company. Let's say $10 million in revenue, and the average contract for the various clients they have is worth $25,000. And honestly, I chose 10 million to make math easy. And the entire scenario is based around making math easy. But you want to quantify it. So in this case, 10 million in revenue, average contract 25,000. Let's say that the risk is that there's no antivirus. That is absolutely a high impact situation. And there's 100 computers. So we have a high likelihood because we have 100 different occurrences where no antivirus could be an issue. So logically, we would say that that's a high risk. So then let's look at what we want to do with that risk. So let's just say, again, for math's sake, this is keeping it easy here, that antivirus costs $50 per year times 100. So to mitigate the risk, it would cost $5,000 a year. All right. Again, super simple math. However, if we have an antivirus situation and the customers find out, or maybe a customer is affected in some way, like data is corrupted, data is lost, data ransomware, whatever, then the thing that could happen is customers could leave, or they could sue you. But let's just, for the sake of math, let's just say they just leave and they take their business with them. So if one customer has a contract worth $25,000, then logically the revenue loss of one customer is $25,000 versus spending $5,000 to fix all the computers for 1 year, and then having a continual revenue of $20,000. So there's a lot of different ways of quantifying risk. The other aspect of quantifying risk, on why it's super important to understand, is the math case I gave you just now is super easy to understand. But you also have to understand, once you quantify something, that there could be situations where you're simply not going to do something. So, for example, if you had a risk that cost $100 to fix, and fixing it would immediately affect 100 different users in the company, and it only costs $100 to fix, then maybe you should just do that, because it's $100. But let's say you have a risk that is, each person, if it's enacted, it costs $50. But then you have 100 different people that could be affected by it. So then technically the risk is worth $5,000. So you have to decide, like, do I want to fix it? Do I not want to fix it? And much like the risk that we talked about before, where the government was fining $25,000 a year. Sometimes you just accept it. Sometimes you don't. So when Arrakis performs a risk assessment, what we try to do is look at as many things as possible that can affect the business. We look at it from the insider threat standpoint, not only from people who appear to be insider threats, but people who could be insider threats. That's a huge thing to look at. Segregation of duties is always a risk. Can the finance person write himself a check and approve the check and receive the check? That's a risk. We look at vendor risk, supply chain risk, things like that. We look at single points of failure. In startups especially, you'll have companies where this one person is not only the IT guy, but he's also the finance guy, and he's also this and that. And so what happens if that guy wins the lottery, or he gets hit by a bus and just decides to not work at the company anymore, or can't work at the company anymore? Maybe he has a heart attack and dies. So what's the risk of a single point of failure in a human, going away? Then also there's single points of failure in relation to technology. If the one firewall in the company goes away, what would happen to the company? Is there a backup plan? If the one server crashes, what would happen to the company? Things like that. We look at office locations. Where the office located at? if they have a single office, or let's say they have 2 or 3 offices, but they're all within 1 or 2 miles of each other, so probably a single earthquake could affect the entire company, as opposed to having multiple offices geographically spread out. Flooding is something we look at. We look at all sorts of different risks, as many as we can think of that are realistic for the environment that the client is in. And again, going back to example about flooding and stuff like that. So we wouldn't care about hurricanes. Wouldn't care about hurricanes in Arizona, but we would care about hurricanes in Florida, and we wouldn't care about volcanoes in Florida, but maybe we would care about volcanoes in Washington, where Mount St. Helens is at, things like that. California, we care about floods, earthquakes, things like that. Ice storms, the temperature is something to consider in the Northeast, the upper Northeast. We look at buildings, how they're laid out, where the server rooms are, things like that. There's a place in, I think it's Ohio, they had a server room on the bottom floor in the basement. This building was right next to a canal, and the basement was, I think, like 5 to 8 feet below the line, below the water line. So if the canal somehow got breached, then they would lose everything, because the server room is on the bottom floor, or in the basement. We look at the experience levels of people that are holding critical roles within a company. We've run across more than once where we've run across people that had the fake it till you make it plan. They got hired, they're great interviewers, things like that, or interviewees, and got the job, had no clue how to do their job. We find that quite a bit in the world nowadays. Another good area of risk that we look at is the potential for fraud. Lots of fraud is certainly very prevalent out there. Another area of risk that we look at are sales. Salespeople across the numerous companies will say whatever it takes to get the sale. And most of those guys will sign contracts so they can get the sale. Sometimes it's because they want to help the company. Sometimes it's they want the commission. Who knows? But the risk is when you commit to something, to a customer and your company can't deliver that, the risk is breach of contract, lawsuits, and so on. So one of the services that we offer at Arrakis is a contract evaluation before the contract is signed, to make sure that it's doable, or giving suggestions to our clients on how they can mitigate the risk of the contract. And unfortunately, after contracts are signed, we'll look at all the contracts to figure out what a company actually has to do in order to be compliant across all of their clients. But in the end, though, what this all of this really depends on is the decision-making process of leadership and the risk appetite that leadership is willing to deal with. Again, going back to the $25,000 fine, the risk appetite, who wants to get a $25,000 fine every year? But when you look at the $4 million it would take to fix whatever the problem was, the risk appetite was okay in that case. Depending on the company that you have, some risk appetites, you absolutely cannot have a risk appetite at all. You have to understand you must mitigate things around privacy or regulatory environments like health information. You can't just say, I'm just going to accept the risk in relation to that, because you could be facing sanctions that could include, incarceration. So as you identify risk, it's super important that you report it to leadership to make sure that leadership knows what they're accepting or trying to mitigate, or the cost, so they can give funding so you can fix the problem. And of course, if you do propose a risk to leadership and you can prove it and things like that, and they say nope, we're not going to do anything about it, or they seem to not be doing anything about it, or sitting on their hands or whatever, then that really kind of gives you an insight into the experience of leadership and the possibly the financial health of the company, which is risk assessing in itself. And then you probably, if you do notify somebody of risk, especially leadership, and they choose not to do anything about it, follow it up in writing so you can say, I told you. Super important, because the risk to you as an individual is that you have no way of proving that you told anybody. So, all right, lastly, before we wrap up here, it's impossible to have zero risk. Literally, it's impossible. There's always going to be a risk of some sort. You can reduce it to the smallest number possible, but it's impossible to have zero risk. If you've ever figured out how to stop earthquakes or tornadoes or hurricanes or things like that, then maybe you can claim zero risk, but no one can. So it's impossible to say that. It's also super important to understand that when you talk risk with other people, if they say, we have no risk at all, then they don't really know what they're talking about, or they haven't fully thought it through, or things along those lines. All right, and with that, thank you for your time. Really appreciate it. If you have any questions or you need help in relation to risk management or risk in general, risk assessments, I will point out third-party risk assessments is a requirement for several regulatory environments. We can help you out. Feel free to contact us at sales@arrakis.com. And absolutely, please subscribe to our YouTube channel, our LinkedIn channel, Facebook, things like that. All of that good stuff. We really appreciate it. And with that, thank you very much. I'm going to go get a beer now. See ya.